and I'm going to present today also on behalf of Professor Baraldi and of Dr. Angela Scollan, who is here with us, while Professor Baraldi, unfortunately, because of academic commitment, examination, and so on, could not attend. Okay, so, and we don't have much time, so I would like to move straight away to the to introduce the presentation, its topic. So okay, so let's give a bit of context of the research. So what we are going to share today are part of the results of an Horizon 2020 project. Horizon 2020 are a large-scale research project funded by the European Commission. And the project I am referring to is called Child Up. And one of its many stages consists in qualitative interviews with teachers and focus group with children in 10 different European countries. Today, we focus on data from English and Italian context. So interviews with Italian and English teachers and focus group with Italian and English children in primary, particularly, and a few secondary schools. So what is interesting is that when the research was designed and then funded, and the interviews were planned to explore several topics concerning integration and intercultural dialogue, which of course they remained as important topics. However, as the interviews took place between November 2020 and March, April 2021. It was a difficult process because of national, local lockdowns and the difficulty to reach out for teachers and for children. And so it was not possible to overlook the effect of the pandemic and its management, public health management of the pandemic. Also because in methodological terms, we are very keen to embrace the voices of participants that almost become co-researcher. And what children and teachers wanted to talk about was, in particular, the pandemic and its effect. So what are discussing today is some initial analysis of data from interviews, and in particular, we will present data and following two, let's say, and two streams. Let's say one concern the impact of the pandemic and its management on children's learning experience, and the other one concerns how the management of the pandemic affected that networks of social relationship, including intercultural dialogue that classrooms can be. Okay, so these are two strands, two streams, and we will approach them from the perspective of the teachers and from the perspective of the children. Because of time constraints that any workshop, any conference does not allow to discuss a large-scale research fully, of course, today we focus on the emerging commonalities between the two contexts, okay? Then there are also specificities and differences that are emerging from analysis, but today we would like to focus on the things that teachers and children narratives have in common across the two national contexts. So, of course, as a very, very, very short theoretical introduction. We have enjoyed very theoretically dense presentation today, but this presentation is more concerned with the discussion of empirical research. So we know that the classroom is not just a learning space. The classroom is also can be a community of dialogic practices, and in particular a community where, in condition of what we know is super diversity, there is the possibility through interactions, through dialogue, to construct, deconstruct, reconstruct, negotiate personal and cultural identities. So the classroom is a very important social space which goes well beyond learning. But what this pandemic, what was the most evident micro effect of the pandemic was that these spaces of interaction and also intercultural interaction, the classroom, were closed. Here it is written for the first time since World War II. Of course, we know that also in Europe there have been, and there still are, situations when unfortunately education is disrupted by war. For instance, I'm talking about the war in the Balkans in the 1990s, the situation at the border between Ukraine and Russia, and many other sad situations. But let's say to that scale, including Western European countries, that was really the first time when education in schools was disrupted. Let's start with teachers' voices concerning the first theme, the impact on children's learning experience. Okay, so, and as a snapshot of the results, I would like to invite your attention to these 3 points. So homeschooling generated new and unforeseen needs. So what was considered as given, as taken for granted, the possibility for children to access a learning space, the classroom, was not all of a sudden appear not to be so guaranteed. So what is interesting from the teacher perspective is that, and we have heard that from the previous speaker as well, thank you for the presentation, by the way, is that the consequences of the pandemic, according to teachers' perspective, are associated to the socioeconomic status of the family. In a way, the pandemic doubles already existent inequalities. These are excerpts from interviews that, of course, I cannot read through for an issue of time, but you can have a look with me. And this is one of the main aspects, that not all children can enjoy positive learning environments at home, because it's an issue of the quality of the accommodation and the spaces and the resources and time that parents can offer children. What is the relevance with, let's say, the more with the relevance with aspects concerning migrant family is that, and I am sharing with you the perspective of teachers. The first one is an excerpt from England. The second one is an excerpt from Italy. And it is not a cultural determinant that affect the quality of children learning experience at home. It's not a cultural variable according to teacher. Is not connected to any ethnicity, religion. Not what it is connected to are material conditions. But then, of course, there is some degree of connection between the condition of migrant and the quality of learning spaces at home, the quality, the living arrangement. This is from teacher's perspective. I'm reporting that. For instance, they say, is it more true for migrant families that there are situations where children, 3 or 4 children of different ages, share and fight for the device that they need for online schooling? It is more true for, it's a situation which is more true for migrant family. It can be, but they say it's not because there is some cultural reason why those families are less interested, less keen on investing in education. It is the quality of spaces, the unavailability of quiet spaces repaired from home life, particularly when also parents sometimes had to work from home or were and furlough. So let's move forward. The second theme concerns, quite interestingly, the effect of the pandemic and its management to the network of social relationship and intercultural dialogue from the perspective of teachers again. So teachers are convinced, absolutely convinced, that the pandemic has affected, still affects peer relationships, so the relationship between children. There are negative consequences of prolonged periods of separation because, lockdowns. And particularly in Italy, lockdown was very, very hard. The first lockdown in spring 2020, and the possibility to meet people outside that was allowed in practice in England was not there, much stricter control. And however, whilst peer relationship have been disrupted, teachers are optimistic that children have the ability to reconstruct their relationship quite quickly. And these are excerpts from Italian and English teachers' narratives. Pandemic, not the pandemic, instead the management from a public health perspective of the pandemic has hindered family-school partnership as well, which particularly when it comes to the English education system is considered pivotal, is considered a pillar of teachers' learning. And that is another aspect where teacher observes that there is a stronger correlation between negative effect of the pandemic on family-school partnership and families with migrant background. But again, it is not because of cultural issues. For instance, cultural variables, for instance, here can be worse for family coming from abroad because normally those families rely a lot on opportunity to meet children, maybe quickly, a quick but important chat when they pick up children, because sometimes they don't have the possibility to attend the parents' evening because they don't have support with children to look after children. So all of those very quick but important interaction were prevented, even when children were back to school, were preventing from social distancing. Okay, so while it is easy to organize it's doable to organize a socially distanced parents' evening where they can discuss about children's experience. Parents were relying on more ephemeral and but again important informal interaction are a bit penalized of that, but not because of their choice, because of the material condition, really. We move forward, unfortunately, quickly to children voices. Okay, the same theme. So what about the impact on children experience from children's perspective now, rather than from teachers? Okay, so there are two main, there is a difference between the online homeschooling and the socially distanced schooling in presence. So when it comes to the online homeschooling, children, and these are excerpts from children with migrant background interviews, loss of autonomy is surely the worst effect of the pandemic. Going to school is also accessing a space when you are a bit more autonomous. Whilst learning from home, many times the parents were with you in the other room because they have to stay at home as well. But this kind of, and some children, while answering, they were feeling less free, less space of being themselves, particularly the older one in secondary school, a bit more concerned in participating in classroom in discussion, because they were not classroom discussion. They were discussion with their classmate and the teacher, but from their home, with the parents, very, close to them. However, on a positive side, for some participants, learning from home meant more responsibility. Without the teacher supporting you continuously and without the teacher controlling you continuously, then you had more responsibility in terms of participating to the lesson. So you are placed in front of the responsibility of participating. When you have the possibility to escape a bit, to switch off, learning from home, it is there when your responsibility to engage is much stronger. And that was appreciated for some of the participants. I move very quickly to the last 3 slides. So when it comes to socially distant schooling, so schooling in presence, but with social distance measures, children, both in Italy and in England, shared a high level of discomfort. Probably learning from school in a socially distant school, particularly for secondary school children, is even worse than learning from home. Why? Because the spatial arrangements due to social distancing rules in school, they really represent physically in a clear way that you can feel at bodily level the change that the pandemic has brought. The disruption of everyday normal network of relationship, including intercultural relationship, is made evident by distancing, by spacing out desk, by the need of having your own chalk, your own pen, the need to sanitize every time you do something, the impossibility as here to touch other people.
So, Dr. Federico, you have another 2 minutes. Sorry to intervene.
Thank you very much. I think they are enough. So more interesting when it comes to children is probably the theme of the effect on the network of social relationship and intercultural dialogue of the effect of the pandemic and its management. So when it comes to home schooling, there is an ambivalent position. There are some participants who insist on the damage made by the pandemic to their social networks, of the network of relationship, not social network in the sense of the online platform, traditional sense of links with friends, peers, and so on, because homeschooling may mean isolation, and also maybe less obviously some participants, the one complain about the negative effect of the pandemic on their network of relationship, they refer to much more conflict. Sounds strange that being separated from others, you end up having more conflicts with others, but this is what some participants have shared, and this is something that to us, in our opinion, deserves research, of course, in the future. From some participants, on the other hand, online learning in a way reinforce bonds because made them appreciate more, sharing time and space with other, and including the creative use of social media. So basically, many children, particularly in England, were sharing that whilst they were attending the online classes, they were also using on another device social media platform or video calls with other to mimic a bit what happens in a traditional classroom.
Federico, you have to wind up, please. Time
Yeah.
is really up.
And so again, socially distanced schooling considered is experienced by children as it is experienced with regard to the learning experience, also with regard to the relationship is experienced in an even more negative way than online schooling, as these excerpts illustrate. And this is the same, so I'm not repeating myself, then what I was saying earlier of really social distance in the classroom represent in a makes it real. And when I say makes it real, I refer makes the pandemic and disruption and change in social experience real. So I would say that I can conclude, I can leave the conclusion here for you to have a look. And yes, public health measure affected children learning experience. Yes, the access to the classroom as a space of socialization has been limited. Family socioeconomic status that it can be connected to the migration status affects children greatly. However, children display high degree of resilience, and very interesting piece of data to be analyzed further. Homeschooling seems to affect their well-being less than socially distanced schooling. And okay, that's the end of our presentation.
When putting together the slides, I had the 15-minute time limit in mind. So unfortunately, unlike Federico, I've not got the kinds of rich data to share with you today, but the full paper will have lots of examples from transcripts and social media interactions online. So thank you to the organizers, thank you Professor Alam, and to the other speakers. I do hope that I can speak to some of the issues that came up this morning from speakers like Nora and Julia and Louisa and others, in terms of how, as an applied linguist, I understand dialogue in the kinds of interactions that occur between refugees and displaced people. So I'll be focusing specifically on data and projects that I've been involved in for about 5 years now in the countries neighboring Syria, so Turkey, Jordan, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and Lebanon, with a particular focus on Jordan today. So really, I'll only have time to frame the kind of theoretical orientation very briefly, but the work that I'm going to talk about today has its roots firmly in the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, on the understanding that all dialogue is situated in the here and now, but it's also the product of previous dialogues. And so I think it was Dr. Yakin mentioned Goffman's work and Goffmanian social linguistics, the kind of interactional social linguistics that I'm interested in, hopefully draw on that kind of micro level interaction, but also say a great deal about power relations and the sort of macro level discourses that circulate when people come together. And so this is the stance that I take, that utterances are always connected, and I'm interested in how discourse analysis enables us to trace some of those interdiscursive links in the kinds of interactions between refugee teachers in particular and refugee learners. Hopefully as a means to contributing to the interdisciplinary approach that people have talked about in detail today, by showing how methodologically we work in a sort of applied linguistics tradition. So as I say, Bakhtin forms the kind of groundwork here for this aspect of language in terms of language innovation. And I'll be talking a little bit about how I understand language in its broadest sense, so kind of categories of communicative practices such as Urdu or Arabic or English, but also I'll say a little bit about translanguaging and work in more kind of recent work, trying to understand how hybrid language practices aren't always necessarily taken up in relation to their standard varieties, but more vernacular practices, more translingual resources are used when people come together in very informal settings. So I can't remember which of the speakers this morning mentioned this, but she talked about that kind of the overlapping of borders and boundaries between public spaces and private spaces. And I'm particularly interested in more kind of informal private spaces like classrooms, but also like the kinds of social media interactions that students have with each other and have with their teachers outside formal classroom settings, because that's where I believe a lot of this kind of dialogue occurs. So we not only remix words when we come together, but we also mix our styles, our genres. People, as I said earlier, they draw on different discourses and they appropriate those discourses in different ways. And it's how they appropriate discourses that I'm particularly interested, and that's where I think the value is of this kind of approach to understanding dialogue in conflict and post-conflict settings. James Paul G, who's written considerably in this area, talks about capital C conversations, the way that the sort of micro level conversation is given its shape by broader societal conversations, and how as discourse analysts can we move between the macro and the micro. And so dialogue here in this kind of framing is less about understanding just the sentence level or the level of the utterance, but also trying to bring in those wider discourses. This is particularly salient given the kinds of cultural mixing, the kinds of intercultural communication that occurs in the refugee settings where I've been working now for a few years. So this particular picture is taken in one of the refugee camps in Lebanon, in the south of Lebanon, where in this particular camp, there were people from different parts of Syria who had been displaced to Lebanon. A mixture of different varieties of Arabic alongside French and alongside English. In other settings where we work, even more linguistic mixing. In the Kurdistan region of Iraq, we have different varieties of Kurdish, we have different varieties of Arabic, and English is often being used as a vehicle for psychosocial support. So the kinds of NGOs that are trying to bring these communities together in what they describe as their social cohesion programs, increasingly use English language classrooms as a vehicle for these social cohesion programs. These aren't a sort of monolithic approach, although there are many similarities between the kinds of activities that they have their participants involved in. So I'm going to focus for the next few minutes on one particular English language program, which is run by an NGO based in Jordan. And the NGO is teaching English to provide refugees and displaced people from the Middle East and North Africa, provide them with access to the genres of English that are needed to gain access to university in Jordan. So Jordan, the medium of instruction in higher education is predominantly English. And so refugees from countries like Syria may not, or it's unlikely that they'll have studied English prior to their movement. And so the NGO is using methodologies informed by Ferrerian types of approaches to dialogic teaching. And they are also trying to bring in this notion of translanguaging, the notion that languages are not sealed off from each other, but are actually very porous and fluid. And what we see are these very sort of rich examples of translanguaging in these highly mobile settings. The bigger picture is this is work that has emerged from work that I carried out for the UNHCR and the British Council back in 2015, 2016, if people were interested in looking at the kinds of programs that are taking place in tented and non-tented settlements, then these are two publications that we've worked on. The first publication, it was designed for donors and policymakers to try to understand the role of language in enhancing the resilience of refugees and displaced people. And the second publication was an attempt to bring together a wide variety of practitioners, as well as academics, to try to understand what is working. So how are the programs that have had success in relation to social cohesion projects, how have they addressed issues of language, and what can we learn from them? So these are the sort of bigger picture policy documents. So really the last part of the presentation is to focus right down to the classroom level and the learner level and the relationships between teachers and learners. And so here we have a sort of discrete project called COVID-19 Migration and Multilingualism. And the idea was to equip refugee teachers from the Middle East and North Africa region working in this one NGO with the skills to carry out research in their own communities. So again, the social cohesion frame is important because that's how the NGO describes the work that it does. It's about bringing young men and women together to get to know each other whilst giving them English language to enable them to access universities. And so we used a mixture of participatory methodologies with some kind of online ethnographic work involved, although it was not very ethnographic in the sense of there was very little participant observation, although we did foreground an insider perspective, which is one of my understandings of how we can use ethnography in these with these communities. And so they the peer researchers, the community researchers, developed their skills to collect data and analyze their data. Analyze the data. The data is taken from a range of different classroom discourse. So what occurred in these lessons online after there was this wholesale shift to learning online in late spring of 2020. And also the way that they took up the affordances of social media and started to use WhatsApp and Facebook as a way of sharing information. And that is where we are starting to see some of the interesting examples of dialogic interaction occurring, where young men and women who had not met each other offline were increasingly sharing information around health, around precautions, as well as other aspects of their life. And so the initial findings, and these are still emerging from our analysis, but I did want to share something with participants today, is that firstly, although we've seen this mass migration of research from physical to digital spaces, there are clear examples of dialogic engagement, and particularly, as I just mentioned, when it comes to the kind of what I would describe as health literacies, the way that people use the language resources in their repertoire, often very unrelated, not often, always very unrelated to proficiency. I'm not talking about proficiency in standard Arabic or proficiency in standard English, but rather these translingual resources where people use the code switching to take that approach that they are familiar with in order to come together to share information. Methodologically, we also are seeing how these digitally mediated interviews on Skype and Zoom were very constrained, very uncomfortable for many of us working in a more ethnographic way in the past. And yet it gave us the opportunity for more peer-to-peer mentoring. So again, in terms of the kinds of opportunities for dialogic engagement, we did see that peer-to-peer support flourished in some cases, not across the board. So my third point here is that mentoring and buddy networks were an absolute essential aspect of researcher participant relationships. But again, language use and understanding those multiple voices that Bakhtin talks about when he explains what he means by this more expansive understanding of dialogue, we see all of these different voices competing for space, even in something as short form as social media, as WhatsApp. So fourthly, managing the remote research teams revealed many difficulties, and so training became very top-down. So I would argue that there was more bottom-up kinds of peer-to-peer relationship building occurring between the peer mentors, but when it came to training, that we the research team who had organized the kinds of project, we became quite heavy-handed in what it meant to train research participants. So we tried, and I'm happy to talk more about this in questions, how we tried. And finally, as a linguist interested in the kind of shifting dichotomy between spoken and written language, what we see increasingly, if there's one thing that I've learned about this kind of work during COVID, is that shift towards a more textually mediated world, that whilst there are lots of constraints about working with text online, when we start to understand text as having much more in common with spoken modes of language, then we do start to see how those kinds of translingual resources are providing opportunities for dialogue. And there are some of my sources, my source material, my references, and I will stop there.
And thank you very much for providing such a great opportunity to share my research here. And good evening. It's around 11 p.m. here in Japan. And yeah, so I'm very a little bit late night for me, but okay. So I'm interested in the international networks of Islam, and I'm continuing my research on the social networks, international students, and I have been conducting field research in Middle East and Southeast Asian country. Recently, I have also been conducting the research on the LGBTQ issues in the Islamic world. But today I would like to share one of my research interest, which is the Muslim international student community. I'm still working on the qualitative research, such as interview for this topic. So here in today's presentation, I'd like to discuss the transformation of Muslim student community in Japan under the COVID-19 situation as an interim report. Okay, so here's the outline of my presentation today. Okay, so in the Japanese university scene, the impact of the COVID-19 began to appear around February 2020. So it was right at the end of the winter semester, so lectures were not affected, but the university was like in a turmoil. The short-term, like for example, short-term study abroad program were suddenly canceled. Japanese students studying abroad for a long period forced to return to Japan. International students returned to their home country one after another without any notification to university admin. And the university could not decide how to accept new international students in the new semester. So it was kind of disastrous situation in last fiscal year. The university has set up, each national university has set up a COVID-19 crisis task force, and is devising its own policy in light of the government's decision and the infection situation in that province or prefecture. So as shown in the figure on the slide, as of the June 16, today, our university, my university's regulation is now low. Okay, so in this slide, I'd like to outline the COVID-19 policy of the university where I work as a case study of a national university. The academic year at the Japanese university ran from April to the following March, so it is not. I think it's not familiar with the other countries. Okay, so first of all, the declaration of state of emergency has been issued intermittently for 3 times since April 2020. The first was for about 2 months, from April to the end of the May. Then for 2.5 months, from January to early March 2021. And then from the mid-May to the present, now we are like under the situation of a state of emergency right now. And picking up on some important matters related to the student life, all the lectures for the spring, summer, and fall semester were online. And in the winter semester, the hybrid of face-to-face and online lecture finally resumed. In the spring semester of 2020, which was started in last April, face-to-face lecture resumed in full. But in the middle of the May, a third state of emergency was made, and the lecture went back to the hybrid or online. And also extracurricular activities such as sports club and activities where multiple students gather in the one place on campus continue to be prohibited since 2020. So in this context, how is the Muslim international student community transforming? So first, let's examine the situation before COVID-19 pandemic. Since before COVID-19, I have continued to conduct research in the community of Muslim international students in the National University, mainly through the participant observation and interviews, which is categorized as the qualitative research. For Muslim students, actually, getting together is the most important things. So this is because international students are usually engaged in the research activities and learning on the laboratory basis. Specifically in Japanese university, especially in the field of the science and engineering, students are assigned to belong laboratories from their undergraduate level. So in the laboratory, all the students from doctoral student to undergraduate students stay in one big room for the student, and each student is given a desk and PC. And senior students have to teach and guide junior students. So a laboratory is a hierarchical organization, but although not strict, but it's some laboratories have a very strict hierarchy between senior and junior. So it can be said that the environment of the laboratories in Japanese universities are like guild. Not only Japanese students, but international students as well continue their research in such a close relationship. So this environment has an advantage of increasing mutual intimacy, but it is also one of the factors that Muslim students often find difficult due to the differences in the language and customs. So therefore, outside of the laboratory, so sharing a meal and time with the student, especially those from same country, chatting in their native language and discuss research, so and so contributes to reducing their stress caused by such a specific intimacy laboratory life. So in an interview with a Muslim student who has been living in Japan for 8 years, he said that it is a little disappointing to be treated as a foreigner, even though I can speak a little Japanese and can communicate with people in stores and restaurants without any problems. In addition to this, the personal and private gathering with people from the same country, there are other activities that serve as a stronghold of the Muslim student. It is a Muslim Student Association. That is the Muslim Student Association. So this association is open to all Muslims, regardless of their nationality. This organization was also deeply involved in the establishment of the masjid in 2009 in Fukuoka area. So since the campus has undergone a major relocation, now it is based in a new campus about like 20 kilometers away from that masjid. So the activities of the activities of this student association are diverse, but the most important is the running of operation of the Friday prayer. The picture on the slide at the bottom shows that the Friday prayer. So our university does not have a special room for the Friday prayer, but they have a large public space in the building of the Faculty of Engineering, and then they use as a space for the gathering every Friday. So like it's like side note, but negotiation with the university authority were also conducted by the representative of the association. So like national university are something like very bureaucratic, so they had to negotiate with a very patiently. In addition, the association organizes various other activities such as iftar and barbecue to foster solidarity among Muslim students and their family. According to the head of the association, Muslim international students are not able to enjoy meal with people in their laboratory because of the food restriction. Also, since their lives are centered on the research, they inevitably feel lonely or alienated. So that's why I want them to enjoy themselves without hesitation through activities that bring everyone together, he said. Their activities strengthen the solidarity of Muslim students and are not limited to the mutual aid help. Once a year, they organize an activity titled Islamic Week for Japanese students of the university and people in the community to learn about the food culture or their country and Islam. So through these activities, they aim to convey the message that Muslim students are, of course, others, but not enemies. As we discussed in the pre-COVID-19 community of a Muslim student, both personal ties and organizational ties through the activities of the Muslim Student Association functioned to foster our sense of the solidarity as a Muslim. So what changes has the COVID-19 pandemic brought to the Muslim student community? As I mentioned in the introduction section, campus access for undergraduate and graduate students remain restricted after March of 2020. While it is possible to go in and out of the laboratories to maintain experimental machines or conduct experiments, the university cafeteria and the grocery store have reduced their operation hours. And you can, as you can see on the picture, that like a partition placed on the table of the cafeteria, so making it physically impossible for them to, gather like this. So as you can see that, there is like a green and yellow partition like between on a white table, so the student cannot eat their lunch or supper face to face. It's like a physically prohibited like this. Okay, so actually our university is rather in a good situation compared to universities in such a Tokyo or Osaka area, because like universities, national universities in urban areas such in Tokyo and Osaka have banned access to their campuses. So in some cases, students are asked to go away by security guard at the gate of the university. So as a result, Friday prayers, which is the most important for Muslim students, have not been held since March 2020. And the Muslim Student Association has issued a notification that Friday prayer should be held at home or in the small spaces in the laboratory with enough personal spaces. Okay, so under these circumstances, the means of the communication among Muslim students changed from face-to-face conversation to like a two-dimensional communication using chat application or message application. So as they spent more and more time at home, especially for Muslim students who come to Japan alone, there are many days that they do not have opportunity to dialect conversation with others. So as a result, one of the students who I had an interview with online said, I feel more and more lonely every day because even though we are chatting through the message application, we are not talking directly to each other like this. So the Muslim Association is also struggling with the issue of how to provide support to these students who are feeling isolated. So they are not able to casually visit their home as they had in the past, I mean before COVID, and they cannot directly check on the situation of the student who are feeling lonely. However, a good opportunity for them to regain their sense of solidarity as Muslim was to organize a street demonstration against the attack on the Palestine. So this was organized by the head of the association, and he reported to the local police and was done officially. So according to the representative, let them feel a sense of solidarity as Muslim. No matter how difficult the current situation, we must not forget about this. So even if we can't see each other in person, we have to keep thinking about how we can help each other, the representative added.
Well, Dr. Hiroko, another 3 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, if you could wind up.
Okay. So let me proceed like a conclusion, but it's like initial findings. So the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically changed the lives of Muslim students. Their sense of solidarity and tie as Muslim, which were fostered through personal tie and the organizational ties of the Muslim International Student Association, where actually gathering and taking face-to-face is most important, has been married the formality by various regulations by universities. The number of students who feel lonely is increasing, and the association is not sure how to respond to this situation. However, they are now in the process of developing activities to somehow maintain solidarity as Muslim students. In other words, the once broken connection or once broken tie among the community is about to be reconstructing and reconnected. So in the future, through paper, I'd like to comprehensively analyze the result of the interviews and participant observation as well as dialogues among the community to clarify the process of the transformation. Thank you.